Hello everyone and welcome to Inside Rugby with Mark. If you haven't been here before, my name is Mark. I'm a retired Kiwi bloke. I'm a huge rugby fan and I'm living here in beautiful Cancun in Mexico. Welcome to today's show. In today's episode, I'm going to have a look at the South African Springboks 2024 season, give you my views and opinions. So let's get into it right now. Boy, has it been a bumper of an international rugby season this year. And the autumn international series has now come to a close. South Africa are the world champions and also back-to-back world champions, I should say. And also rugby championship champions. And also they went unbeaten in their autumn international series. So let's have a look at their season. I'm going to give you, as a Kiwi, my very neutral, unbiased opinion about where I think the Springboks team is at. Some of the dangers, some of the players that stood out for me this season and why they stood out, and also looking to the future. So let's get right into it now. So starting off, having a look at their season in general, the South Africans played 13 international test matches in 2024. They won 11 of those and they lost 2. So how significant were those losses and what can we expect in the future? Now, I've been saying all year long that I think the top of international world rugby at the moment for men is very, very close, and any of the top teams on any given day could beat the opposition. So is it really the fact that South Africa is so far ahead of the rest? Well, as we go through their season and have a look at the results that they achieved, I want to keep one thing in mind, or I want you to keep one thing in mind, and that is a little formula that I use just to gauge how close potentially these games are. And that is, if any team gets within 7 points of their opposition, then I feel the result could have gone the other way. After all, it's just a converted try. And in this day and age, as far as rugby goes, we know we've had a lot of tight finishes, and if a team is able to score a try at the end of a game, it can obviously bring them back into the game to win. So just bear that in mind as we go through the results of the South Africans in 2024. So first of all, they kicked off their season against Wales. They had a comfortable win against Wales, 41 points to 13. No one, I don't think, was expecting Wales to give the Springboks any challenges in that particular game. As we know, Wales is very much in the early development of their rebuilding phase, and South Africa was always potentially going to be too strong for them in that game. And then we went on to that much anticipated series in South Africa between South Africa and Ireland. And were Ireland going to be able to upset the Springboks at their home, in their home territory? Well, the first game went the way of South Africa, 27 points to 20. And bear in mind my little formula, maybe that was a lot closer than what we had thought. And then in the second game, thanks to young Frawley, we had a fantastic finish, and the Irish picked South Africa by 1 point and won that game by 25 points to 24. It was a thrilling game. It went down to the last minute, of course, and again, using my formula, that game could have quite easily gone to South Africa. And then after that, well, South Africa did the right thing and they played against one of the developing rugby nations in Portugal. They welcomed them to South Africa. And it was a fantastic game for South Africa because it gave Rassie another opportunity to share around the workload with his squad. And as we saw throughout the 2024 season, this was a trend from Rassie Erasmus. He was always trying new players. Over 50 players tried this season, and it really gave him a good taste to see the depth of talent that he has within the Springbok unit. And it was fascinating to see that game against Portugal. Of course, South Africa won out very comfortably in that game. They scored over 60 points. But one of the things that was very interesting for me in that game was that Portugal scored 21 points against South Africa. And I think if there was any negatives at all to take away from that game, I think Rassie and his coaching crew would have been a little bit upset with the fact that Portugal did end up getting 21 points. And I'm going to talk about the ability of the South Africans to score points this season, as well as their defence later on in this video, so stay tuned for that one. So a good win over Portugal, and then the Springboks headed off to Australia to start the Rugby Championship competition for 2024, and their first game was against Australia in Brisbane at Suncorp Stadium. And everybody thought that the Springboks were going to be way too strong for a rebuilding Australian team under Joe Schmidt, and that was the case at Suncorp Stadium in that first game. The Australians showed a glimmer of hope in the first 15 or 20 minutes of that game, where they went very physical against South Africa, but then the South Africans' power and ability out wide really shone in that game, and they ended up winning it quite comfortably. It was 33 points to 7 in that first game in Brisbane, and it was really good for South Africa, I think, to get that win in Australia. Sometimes Brisbane has been a little bit of a bogey ground for the Springboks, so they started off their rugby championship campaign with a really good win. And then both teams flew over to Perth in Western Australia for the second game in that competition this year between Australia and South Africa. Unfortunately, the weather gods weren't on the side of the rugby fans. It was a miserable day in Perth. It rained tremendously, and it really took a lot of the gloss out of the game, and South Africa were able to overpower Australia again with a fantastic forward domination, and they ended up winning that game by 30 points to 12. A little bit of resilience there from Australia in that game, but nothing to what we were going to see from them later on in the season. But the Springboks had started the Rugby Championship off just as Rassie would want, 2 strong wins, and getting them prepared to take on the New Zealand All Blacks back home in South Africa, which was obviously going to be one of the pinnacle series of this year's competition for the South Africans. So this was going to be a really interesting series for me. Of course, New Zealand rebuilding their team under Scott Robertson, the first time as a head coach of the New Zealand All Blacks, coming up against a very well and tried South African team under Rassie, who had a lot of experience, a lot of those players from the Rugby World Cup last year. And New Zealand were missing some of the might of Aaron Smith, Richie Mo'unga, Sam Whitelock and Brodie Retallick. So how were this young developing New Zealand team going to be able to go against the Springboks? Well, that first game was a cliffhanger, 31 points to 27 to South Africa. And again, using my formula of 7 points, that game could have potentially gone either way if the All Blacks were able to score another try. They didn't, of course, and South Africa ended up winning that game. But this was a really interesting gauge for me to see where the South African team was. We had players in there like Sasha Feinberg and Ngomazulu, and I thought he stood up really well. And one of the things that I'd been saying throughout the year for the All Blacks was that Scott Robertson hadn't been experimenting enough with some of his key positions for the All Blacks. And I think that's one thing that Rassie continued to do throughout the season. And by giving Sasha that opportunity to play against the All Blacks at home, I think was a bit of a masterstroke, because it really showed us how good Sasha Feinberg and Ngomazulu is in that number 10 jersey for the Springboks. And then we went on to the second game in Cape Town, and again it was relatively close in terms of scoreboard. South Africa ended up winning that one by 18 points to 12, using the 7-point formula again. If the All Blacks had scored another try, they could have got that one as well. So I think these games were a little bit closer than what a lot of people had imagined. South Africa were dominant, there's no doubt about it. Their power both in the forwards and their ability to express themselves out wide was the difference in those 2 games against the All Blacks. But I think the All Blacks had really not hit their form at this time of the season, and I would have loved to see the 2 teams clash later on in the year. That wasn't going to be the case. So next up for the Springboks was a trip to Argentina, and I'm sure that Rassie and the crew were not underestimating the power of Argentina. We'd seen them beaten the All Blacks at home in New Zealand throughout the beginning of the Rugby Championship, and it was a really good opportunity for Rassie to test himself in terms of selection, which he did in that first game in Argentina. And it was an opportunity for Argentina maybe to upset the South African Springboks, the world champions, back at home. And upset them is exactly what they did. A 1-point win, a cliffhanger of a game. And as I've said, using my 7-point formula, that game could have gone either way as well. On this occasion, it went to the way of the Argentinians by 29 points to 28. It was a fantastic game. It was a nail-biter right to the end. So by the time that South Africa went back home to Mombala Stadium, there was an air of vengeance in the air, and it was an opportunity for the South Africans to put things right in their terms, and they had a comprehensive win against Argentina in that reply encounter in Nelspruit. And it ended up being 48 points to 7, a dominating game by South Africa. In that game, they played some very good, expansive rugby, and they really put Argentina to the sword. A lot of people were saying, well, Argentina had to travel, and Rassie changed the team yet again, saved a lot of the players for that return leg. but it doesn't matter how we looked at it. South Africa were too dominant in that game against Argentina and deserved fully that great win at the Mbombela Stadium. So that was it for the Rugby Championship, and South Africa had ended up winning that competition as well. So not only back-to-back World Cup champions, but also they were able to win the Rugby Championship in 2024. So hats off to everyone involved in that. So then we had to wait for the Northern Tour, and there was 3 games this year for South Africa. They were going to play England, Scotland and Wales. And what we were going to see a dominant South African performance in those games, or were we going to see the home nations give up a bit of a fight against the world champions? Well, first up was England at Twickenham. And of course, there was a lot of talk about what England could possibly do. Of course, they'd pushed the All Blacks quite close in New Zealand in that short series they had down under. So were they going to be able to bounce back at the end of the year and try and take on the world champions and beat them? Well, it was a physical encounter to say the least, but again, South Africa's dominance both up front and also in their backline shone out in this particular game. They ended up winning against England by 29 points to 20. Next up was Scotland at Murrayfield, and as most people have been agreeing, Scotland is a much improved team this year, and they've been playing some very, very good rugby under Gregor Townsend. They have that backline power that's very, very good, but were their forwards going to be able to keep pace with South Africa throughout this game, particularly with the bomb squad coming on and making a huge difference? Well, the short answer was no. They weren't able to do it in Scotland's favour, though. They did muff a couple of opportunities where they had them for tries. That could have made the scoreboard a lot closer, but in the end it was another very dominant performance, I thought, from the Springboks, and they really made a difference at the end of the game. The powering in their scrummage was awesome, and of course they scored that late try through that brilliant scrummage try as well. So ended up running out winners against the Scottish team by 32 points to 15. I think the score was not so indicative of the game. I think it was a lot closer than that, but South Africa did really dominate in the last 20 minutes of that game. And then it was on to the Principality Stadium in Cardiff for their final game of the Northern Tour, and that was against Wales, of course. And I don't think there was too many people picking an upset for Wales against South Africa in this game, and that's exactly how it turned out. South Africa just turned on their ability to be able to score tries in that first half. They ran away with it in the first half. They did have a few issues in keeping that momentum going in the second half, but the game was really over at half-time, in my opinion. So in the end, it was 45 points to 12 to the Springboks, and I think it was another really good performance. It was one of their best first half performances, I thought, throughout the 2024 season. They really turned it on, and despite a few lapses in the second half, they were able to keep Wales only to 12 points. So their defensive line was very strong, and I think Rassie would have been really happy with that. So those are the games that South Africa played throughout the 2024 season. What were some of the things that stuck out for me in the Springboks team this year? Well, a couple of things statistically stood out for me this year, and the first one is the defence of South Africa. Their opposition were only able to average 17 points against the Springboks, and if you're going to beat the Springboks team, you need to score a lot more than 17 points. So I think Rassie would have been very happy with their overall defensive performance in 2024. There was some big work in the centres, in particular by Damian Deolandi and Jesse Creel, and I think these guys are sometimes underrated in terms of what they do defensively for the Springboks. And I think by keeping their opposition to 17 points throughout the season, this was a really, really good achievement by. Now on the flip side, South Africa were able to average 32 points throughout this year. I've actually taken away the Portugal score from these statistics because it does sway things a little bit with that 60-point score. But they were able to score on average against all of the other teams 32 points this season. And I think that's an indication of how much more attacking and expansive South Africa are playing. And that results in more points on the scoreboard. So this puts a lot of pressure on their opposition, because not only do they have to try and get through this great South African defensive line, but they also need to find ways to score points, and that can also be done through penalty kicks, making sure their discipline's under control. And we saw a lot of the opposition this year have problems with discipline against the Springboks, because either the emotion or the adrenaline was a bit stronger, and they went in and they made technical mistakes. So for the likes of the All Blacks, we saw yellow cards. One of the things that the opposition really need to focus on when they're playing South Africa is to make sure they keep their discipline in check, because it can become very costly on the scoreboard. Okay, so let's talk about some of the players that really stood out for me in 2024 for the Springboks. And of course, if you're a South African supporter, you're going to be able to find more names to add to this list. I'm not trying to name everybody in the team, although the whole team had a very good season, but there were a few players that really stuck out for me that I think were exceptional in this year. And I've got to start off with their captain, Siya Kolisi, and I think that he had one of the best years I've ever seen him have in a Springbok jersey. And this goes unnoticed a lot of the time, and it's because the South Africans have so many great forwards. And of course, Peter Steph du Toit does such a fantastic job in that number 6 jersey. But I think Siya Kolisi played really, really well this year. He was very, very big in the games against New Zealand, and he was not only just showing his leadership ability with his team, but he was putting in really good performances on the field. So Siya Kolisi was one of the players that stood out for me for the Springboks this year. Of course, Peter Steph du Toit, he just keeps on giving, doesn't he, as far as the Springboks team goes, but also to rugby on a general global level. I think he's a superstar of the game. I think Peter Steph du Toit is now getting up there in terms of legendary status on a global basis for the game of rugby. What he does in that number 6 jersey is just phenomenal. His work rate is enormous. And how often do we see him on the outside channels scoring tries as well? He's absolutely brilliant. So not only is he a fantastic player in the Springboks team, but I think he's a great role model for the game across the world in terms of how much hard work and effort goes in to playing for your country in that particular jersey. And I think Steph du Toit is really a role model in so many aspects for that. So he played absolutely brilliantly this year. Looking at the rest of the South African forwards, a couple really stood out for me, and one of them was Ruan Nortje. I thought he played really well this year when he was given an opportunity by Rassie. He really took that opportunity, and not only at the games I've seen him play with the Bulls, I think he's been fantastic for the Springboks, and when he was paired up with Eben Etzebeth, he was absolutely outstanding. Oxen Chair was another fantastic contributor to the Springboks team in 2024. Many of you were yelling for him to be nominated for Player of the Year. I would not have disagreed with that at all. And I think what Ox gave to the Springbok front row this year was exceptional in terms of the stability and the technical accuracy that he brings. And I love seeing him have a run or two in general play. Eben Etzebeth, of course, broke the record of Victor Matefield this year in terms of most caps for a Springbok player. He keeps on giving, doesn't he? Eben Etzebeth had a fantastic year, I thought. A couple of times he just showed us that he's on the edge of the legalities when it comes to some of the plays that he goes into. But you got to love that about the guy, because he's giving 110% all the time. And I think he had a really, really good season. Now, another forward that stood out for me was Jasper Wiese. I thought he started off a little bit average this year for the Springboks, but as the season went on, he got better and better. And I just saw him doing some wonderful things, particularly on the Northern Tour for the Springboks, and I think he had a fantastic end of the season. So Jasper Wiese was another really, really stood out for me. Rassie was giving us a view of a lot of new players that we hadn't seen too much of in the Springbok jersey this year. As I said earlier in the video, over 50 players getting an opportunity in the Springbok jersey this year. And you've got to absolutely love Rassie for that, because I think it's exactly what to do in terms of the first year after the Rugby World Cup, to build depth in your squad again, and just to see what inventory is out there and what abilities they've got. And it was Sasha Feinberg and Ngomazulu for me who came on the scene first of all and really ignited a new change in the way that the Springboks played. And his ability with his skill set is going to be something enormous for the Springboks team as they move forward. And I was very impressed with his composure against the All Blacks. I thought he did very well in what must have been one of the highest games of his career so far. So Sasha Feinberg and Ngomazulu, I think he's going to light up rugby fields across the world in the coming years. And by the time we get to the 2027 Rugby World Cup in South Africa, I think he's going to be a standout star for the Springboks team, no doubt about it. Now let's talk about halfback for the Springboks, because Faf de Klerk was out this year. And how much of a difference did we really notice with Faf not being there? Well, to be honest, I love Grant Williams. And with the games that I saw Grant Williams play in, I thought I saw a player that is the future of the Springbok halfback position. The speed he has, the ability to be able to run and do those sniping runs, his distribution is very good, his kicking and general play is very good, And once he really brings up that level of his defensive ability, I think he's going to be one of the best halfbacks in world rugby. So I'm excited to see more of Grant Williams in the Springbok jersey. It's going to be interesting to see what happens when Faf de Klerk comes back in 2025. So for me, Jaden Hendrickse, he's another one we got to talk about. I've got to say, I'm not such a fan. I saw a couple of things from his general play that wasn't too good. I think he's a little bit too slow, and he just doesn't give the right fit that I see within Grant Williams and Sasha Feinberg and Ngomazulu as a combination at 9 and 10 for the Springboks. But I think we're going to see Rassie stick with Jaden Hendrickse as we go forward, because he's one of those players I think that can be used in the rotation of the Springbok squad. But don't forget about Cobus Reinhardt. I think Reinhardt still has a lot to offer the Springboks team, and when he did come on at different times throughout this year, I think he played pretty solid. There's no doubt about it, the Springboks, like in a lot of positions, have a lot of inventory available at halfback. But my tip is for Grant Williams to really take ownership of that jersey as we move forward over the next couple of years, looking towards the next Rugby World Cup. What I thought was a really good move by Rassie this year was that 10 combination between Sasha Feinberg and Ngomazulu starting the game and Handré Pollard coming on. I think that's a really dangerous combination for South Africa. It works very well against the opposition. You've got Ngomazulu that can be part of the early game where South Africa is looking to score a lot of points. And if there's any need to settle a game down or maybe just bring a little bit more structure to it, you've got someone like Handré Pollard who can come on and do that in the second half. So I think that combination of Sasha and Feinberg and Ngomazulu and Handré Pollard going into next year is going to work perfectly well. What happens to Manie Libbok? What happens to Jordan Hendrickse? Those are questions that we're going to need to see answered from Rassie. But I think also we'll continue to see those two players involved in the South African rotation system. But for me, Ngomazulu and Handré Pollard, that's going to be the combination that I think is going to work best for South Africa in 2025. I think what we saw again this season in the number 12 and 13 for South Africa was exactly why Damian Deolandi and Jesse Kriel are making history as a combination in those two jerseys. They play brilliantly together. They understand each other's movement, particularly in defence, which is huge. And they are a large part of the reason why South Africa has limited the opposition to an average of 17 points against them. I saw a lot more of Damian Deolandi being a little bit more attacking in some of the games later on this season, and that excites me as well. He's kind of got that Bundy Aki kind of bustling run through defensive lines, and I think South Africa should move more or use more of that in games as they look to expand their game out wide. And I think Deolandi can be a really good contributor in that area. And then moving out to the wings, well, it was all about Kurtley Arendse and also Cheslin Kolbe for me this year. They are the standout wingers for the Springboks in my mind. Makazolo Mapimpi is brilliant though. He scored some brilliant tries. And as far as I'm concerned, we don't see enough of Canan Moodie. And I hope that's a player that we do get to see more of next year. But for me, with Kolbe and with Arendse, we're seeing fantastic try scoring from all over the field. Cheslin Kolbe for me this year was up there with Peter Steph du Toit in terms of player of the year. I think he had an absolutely fantastic season again. He's so consistent, but his game management for me is brilliant. If you watch the work he does off the ball, where he evolves himself in the play, he knows exactly how to keep the opposition out, and he also knows how to do that break at the right time in a game. So for me, Cheslin Kolbe was a standout player for the Springboks in 2024. And then the other one in the back line that surprised me a little bit this year of how good he played was Rassie at fullback. I thought he had a couple of really fantastic games for the Springboks, and he grew more and more into that jersey. And of course we're waiting for Damian Willemse to be uninjured and have a long stay in that Springbok jersey at fullback. But I tell you what, in Rassie they've got a fantastic player to back up Willemse if he comes back and takes that 15 jersey away from Rassie. But what I saw this year from Rassie was very, very impressive. He's very good under the high ball. He's very good at counter-attacking. And he's now starting to bleed himself into that combination with Kolbe and Arendse and also Damian Deolandi and Jesse Kriel, and I think that's a very dangerous backline for the Springboks when you've got someone like Rassie who can also come in and run different angles on their attacking line. So watch out for Rassie next year. I think he's still going to be an integral part of the Springboks team, no matter what happens when Damian Willemse comes back into this team. It's hard to be critical of the South African team anywhere, but if there were a couple of players where I went, didn't play fantastically well throughout the season on a consistent basis, well, the first person I put on that list was Kwagga Smith. I don't think he really lived up to his normal, extremely high level of play. And maybe that's because the bar is so high with Kwagga Smith. But listen, I'm being ultra critical here. I don't think it's a case of any of the South Africans being super poor this year. I just think so many of the players are raising the bar to a certain level that when you don't have an outstanding performance sometimes, then you can actually see it. And I just saw that a little bit with Kwagga Smith throughout this year. Also, Malcolm Marx was up and down a little bit. He had some really good games where he came in, he scored the tries that he usually does. But again, I don't think he was consistently at his best throughout the season. And it might have been just something I was missing in their games. But again, I'm being super critical when I say these things about those particular players. And another one that I would put in that category would be Lucano. I don't think he was at his brilliant best this year either. But again, when we're seeing Damian Deolandi and Jesse Kriel do their things at 12 and 13, it's very hard to replace those guys with the level of consistency that we see. So Lucano, when he does come on, he's got a very big pair of shoes to fill in replacing either of those guys. Okay, so in summary, what do I think of South Africa's 2024 season? Well, of course, it was a fantastic season. They won the Rugby Championship. They beat the All Blacks 2-0 at home. They had a great series against Ireland as well, and then they went to on their northern tour, and for their autumn international series, they were able to come away with 3 wins. So they had, of course, a very good season. I love the way that Rassie's building more depth into this team, and maybe in 2025, we are going to see, he's already announced that we're going to see a reduced number of players in the squad, and then we're going to start to see this whole team form itself into preparation for the next few years leading up to the Rugby World Cup in 2027. So that's going to be very exciting to see. And in my humble opinion, I don't think the Springboks are that far ahead of the pack of chasers than what some people think they are. And I think the Springboks team is definitely beatable. A team that's going to play an expansive game and has the ability to score a lot of tries and put that pressure on the South African defence is going to be the team that beats them. We saw that in Argentina when they started playing that very good expansive game. They were putting the pressure on the South African defence, and it ended up paying off. In very close games, we saw what happened against Ireland. They were able to take that with very calculated precision at the end, but you can't rely on that always. And I think a team that's going to beat South Africa on a consistent basis has to be a team that can score a lot of points. And for me, that's a team like Ireland or the New Zealand All Blacks. And I can say this also, I think Australia next year are going to be a big force to be reckoned with as well, as they continue their upward trajectory. So I'm not going to say this is going to happen overnight. This is a fantastic Springbok squad, and they're going to keep on winning, that's for sure. But I'm not giving up hope for the other teams, because I think I see a lot of things in the South African play that other teams are going to be able to get on top of, and they're going to be able to beat the Springboks team in 2025. So everybody in the South African coaching setup, all of them, not just Tony Brown and Rassie Erasmus, all the other people that are involved in preparing this team and getting them out on the pitch and also performing in the way they do, I think they all need to take the credit in 2024. Oh, I tell you what else South Africa won this year. They won the singing of the national anthem. I just thought it was absolutely brilliant. The way that Khaleesi puts his soul and heart into that rendition every single time. There's not another captain in world rugby at the moment that's able to meet that level of passion. So I give South Africa my award for singing of the national anthem this year. It was absolutely beautiful stuff. So there you go, that's my summary of the Springboks in 2024. Hats off to all the South African supporters. Thank you for being part of my channel. I love reading your comments. I'm learning a lot about South African rugby and all the players you've got coming through the respective systems, and it's going to make me a lot more knowledgeable coming up to next year and all the things we've got to look forward to. So I thank you for that, and I appreciate it, and I hope I'm getting better at announcing a lot of the South African names as well as we've gone through this season. Okay, that's it for this video, everyone. Thanks for watching. If you do like my content, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like as well, and I'll see you again really soon from here in beautiful Cancun in Mexico. Until next time, stay safe, stay well, keep enjoying your rugby across the world, and it's time to say adios from me. Bye for now.